So, welcome back, everyone. Can I just give us a few minutes to get settled? And we would like to start with the reparations panel, which I just give heads up after that very rich presentation by the ambassador. It leaves very little for me to do. I scrolled down in my remarks as chair and I said, and what am I supposed to now say? So thank you very much. It was very, very rich and so much food for thought. So I'm going to move in, and if you don't mind, because we actually have the same panelists, I will skip the introductions at this stage and move right into what I believe is just a continuing discussion. We've started the conversation. Much of the issues have already been flagged. The only thing I think I would love to frame it also within a certain lens, and that's the lens of the Nairobi Declaration on Women and Girls' Right to a Remedy and Reparation. And some of the specific issues that are highlighted there and which we've seen in the Ongwen ongoing reparations process, as well as in other reparations decisions, for example, in the case of Bosco Ntaganda at the ICC. So focusing in particular in our discussion on the gender differentiated impact of armed conflict on the lives and livelihoods of women and girls, and we've heard that as well in the ambassador's presentation, and the need for a gender specific and gender sensitive approach to reparations, the importance of inclusive and non-discriminatory reparatory frameworks and processes which do not only acknowledge the structural barriers and inequalities which predated the conflict, but those which continue to aggravate the discrimination and suffering of women and girls and others in post-conflict situations. The need for accessible, victim-centered, and victim-led reparations processes. And I had a discussion with Victoria for her to explain to me what, in her view, was the difference between victim-centered and victim-led. And we'll probably pick up on that during our discussion later on. But these processes which are adapted and specially adapted to the needs, interests, and priorities of women and girls and those who have suffered gender-based violence as defined by them. The issue of reparative complementarity, again flagged by the ambassador, highlighting the primary responsibility of the state to repair the harm, which should complement other efforts that are ongoing, including at the ICC and in other contexts. And in that context, I'd like to examine the Ugandan transitional justice process, and we have Margaret who will speak to that. And then the timing of reparations. How long should victims wait before harms are repaired? And what can and should be done in the meantime? The issue of interim reparations, which was flagged by Pamela. And then how does delay affect victims? Just for context, I'd like to give a little bit of background as to where things are with the reparations process in Ongwen. Because reparations have not been issued, there is not yet a reparations decision. The chamber did opt to begin the reparations process while the appeals process was ongoing, and they invited amici submissions from which a number of Ugandan organizations, community-based organizations responded to. So this is just to make it clear. I think yesterday someone mentioned the reparations decision, but to clarify, the decision has not yet been handed down, but the process is ongoing, and the registry of the ICC is actually conducting mapping of the victims who are affected by the crimes for which Ongwen has been convicted. I think it's also important to recall the limitation of the ICC's reparations framework and process. The reality is, and this has been stated before, that only victims that are victims of the crime for which Ongwen has been convicted would be eligible for reparation, which raises several other issues, which we hope the discussion about the transitional justice will be able to address when we look at the broader framework. So without further ado, I'd love to continue the conversation which we've started this morning, and to ask Margaret to begin by telling us, giving us a little bit more context about how the Ugandan government, and I know you cannot speak on behalf of the government, but the transitional justice framework and process. What do you see as the role of the transitional justice process in relation to reparations?
Thank you, Lorraine. I'll beg to kind of take off from the last discussion. In my discussion about the transitional justice process and reparations in Uganda, there were some questions that I teased out, which I think were ably answered by Ambassador and the other participants. So basically, I was teasing out the question on the cost of reparations and basically funding for reparations. And Ambassador, you rightly said that we shouldn't promise when we don't have the funding. And that's one of the challenges that I think we faced drafting this whole transitional justice processes in Uganda. It was straight out of Juba, and then government has obligations, and then get a legal framework without thinking, where do we get the money, or do we have the money? So that was the longest period for government to start thinking about, do we have the money? Do we actually set up this process when we don't have the money? And I think that's the biggest dilemma that I have as an individual who also comes from Northern Uganda, who interfaces with these ladies every day, telling them that, yes, we have a legal framework, but we don't have, or government is not sure about where the funding is going to come from. So that's one of the key challenges. And then the other key challenge, yes, states have the role and the obligation to pay reparations, but I think many times we do not put into context the fact that states are sometimes reluctant to acknowledge paying reparations when they're not directly responsible for violations. And that's exactly the situation in Northern Uganda, where the majority of the atrocities were committed by the LRA. Yes, there might be atrocities that could have been committed by the other party, but that acknowledgement for the state to actually say we are going to pay for reparations for crimes that we did not commit is something that I think many states are grappling with. And it takes me to the issue of how meaningful then are reparations that are paid by the state, by the ICC to victims. How meaningful is it to them that someone paying for reparations is actually not the person that aggressed them? So those were issues that I have been grappling with, that we've been grappling with in this whole reparations process. And then also the issue that was mentioned about trying to the extent possible to look at the sources of wealth of these belligerent groups, the armed groups. And I always question the issue of the LRA. They were able to sustain themselves for over 2 decades. Where were they getting the funding from? So can we look further and see where or other sources of funding, so that that funding or those sources can actually be used for reparations? So then going back to our policy, the transitional justice policy, which Pamela said I rightly was at the center of for over 12 years when I joined the ministry, basically tasked to design a framework for the government of Uganda. And our obligations stem basically from the Juba Peace Accord between the government of Uganda and the LRA. The final peace accord was not signed, but there was the agreement on accountability and reconciliation that required that the government of Uganda puts in place various transitional justice mechanisms, including reparations. So the obligations, of course, derive from Juba and also our national and international obligations for reparations. So some of the issues that the policy looks at, the policy, just to give a little bit more context, looks at 5 mechanisms of transitional justice. It looks at the amnesty process. We still consider amnesty a transitional justice process, but we are contextualizing it in a way that amnesty must, there must be some form of accountability. Angela talked about it. It was an issue that we looked at closely. And also, as Ambassador Beth said, the issue of seclusion of victims. We had an amnesty process, which was through the DDR process, supporting the ex-combatants, but the victims in the community was feeling victimized. So there was that issue of, so those who were abducted and returning are being prioritized, and yet we who stayed home and watched our daughters and sons being abducted and taken away, there's nothing being done. So that's a balance that we need to strike. The other transitional justice mechanism that the policy looks at is our traditional justice mechanisms. We, as part of alternative justice, believe that our traditional justice mechanisms can deliver reparations. And I will talk about reparations in the context of traditional justice for purposes of healing, memory, and the issue of identity of these children who are born of war. We have evidence from the traditional institutions that they can actually support reintegration and identity tracing of these children, which is something the formal justice system cannot do. The formal justice system will tell you to go do a DNA, which is already re-traumatizing. But in the traditional justice processes, the chiefs believe that they can use these processes to trace these children, to reunite them with their original families, and try to mediate some of the grievances that they have. The other mechanism that we are looking at in the transitional justice policy, of course, is the formal criminal justice process. We talked about the ICD, there are challenges with it. Of course, but with the issue that we mentioned, we're trying to look at customary international law, try in order to bridge some of the gaps with the issues of retroactivity. So I think we'll manage that. And then finally, we also are looking at aspects of truth and reconciliation, and mainly looking at the aspect of nation building. Can we use truth and reconciliation to build the nation, to get more coexistence and healing? So with regards to reparations, we are envisaging interim, medium-term, and long-term reparations, like Pamela rightly said. And we think that reparations are important to reintegrate many of the victims back into society. We also feel that reparations are important because many of the government programs that exist right now that so this is a challenge that we faced while justifying the policy. Many policymakers in government told us we already have programs that are targeted to northern Uganda. We have development programs, we have this, so why do you want reparations? So we had to say that the government programs that you have are development programs. They are not directly tailored to the needs of the victims, but it's something that governments do not easily see, because post-conflict governments are looking at reconstruction, they're looking at development. So that's another issue that we tried as much as possible to contextualize in that context. And we said, you cannot have development, you cannot have economic development if you have a group of your society that is still disenfranchised. They cannot translate those programs into development programs because they're still traumatized. So basically, you're going to invest in a region which cannot contribute to economic development because they still have trauma. I still remember one of the girls, I asked them, do you access any of the government programs? She said, yeah, they gave me cows, they gave me cattle, but where do I put them? There's issues of access to land. They don't have the land, and then they do not have the capacity or even just the embodiment to be able to translate these programs and processes into development. Of course, the other issue that we justified also for reparations is the issue of the physical and other traumatic events that the victims have gone through. The issue of children born of war is captured in the policy, and we expect that this should be addressed in that way. So how do we expect to deliver reparations? I wouldn't want to go back so much into what Ambassador has already said, but one of the ways we expect to deliver reparations is through a comprehensive law. It's incumbent on all government programs that for them to attract any funding from the consolidated fund, it must be coming from some piece of law. So otherwise, you cannot justify government funding programs which are not embedded in law or policy. So we expect to have the Transitional Justice Act passed into law, but like Pamela said, we still have challenges that need, I think, need support from different actors to fast track this process. We expect to also come up with a structure to implement reparations, basically a reparations program that I think Ambassador Beth talked about quite eloquently. And to do that, of course, we expect to map out who our victims are. Who are the victims? What did they suffer? Because the Victoria and Angela, again, sorry for putting in the spot, they're just a small fraction of the victims. They were abducted, but we do not yet know their mothers, their uncles, their fathers, who are also suffering other traumatic events. The people who still have bullet wounds in their bodies. There's a wide array of the victims. So we expect to do a mapping violations, know who they are, what did they actually suffer, so that the reparations programs are tailored to those needs. So some of the reparations interventions that we envisage, of course, are individual, collective, material, symbolic, and also memorialization efforts. And basically, we hope that it will be able to support restitution, restitution in the context that when the war was taking place in northern Uganda, many people had to be moved into internally displaced camps. And those camps, of course, were properties of other people. So in the process of internal displacement, people lost their land, they lost the value of their land. So it's something also that could be considered in terms of land restitution. We're also looking at socioeconomic benefits, because when we did the study for reparations, that's one of the things that are top on victims' needs. I think that came up yesterday, whether victims actually need compensation or other socioeconomic needs. I think a majority of the people that we interviewed wanted socioeconomic support. The young women and men in the communities have their own support groups. They have small village banks that they support themselves. They save whatever they can in their small village banks. So they need socioeconomic support. They need social services, of course, schools, medication, and that's a big thing in terms of social services for health. A number of them who are not yet supported in that regard. We also look at issues of symbolic reparations, like, I don't know if you'll understand this, but this is very important for the communities, burials and reburials of the dead. It's an intervention that was done mostly by the traditional institutions. Many people feel that they need to have a form of decent burial. So in the Choli tradition, even though someone is not found, if their remains are not found, they can still hold a symbolic burial. And there is a plant, I think it's the sausage tree. If you know the fruit of the sausage tree, it's actually symbolically buried to symbolize someone who died. Construction of memorials and monuments, remembrance, memorials and monuments. I think memorials are good in my opinion, but I think also trying to manage re-traumatization. I think, like Ambassador Beth said, sometimes we do not know whether actually memorials re-traumatize people. They have to live through what happened all over again. So as much as we propose them as reparations measures, I think we also need to be very careful in terms of how the impact. And then lastly, of course, we're looking at issues of apology, acknowledgement, but who then does that? Who is going to apologize? Who is going to acknowledge that, that this happened? So I think briefly, that's what transitional justice framework looks at in terms of what a reparations program should look like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. There are many issues that you flagged there that as chair, I definitely would want to pick up on, but I wonder whether any of the other panelists would like to give us their perspective on the transitional justice policy and how that is impacting victims at the moment, the delay in the process of passing the policy, all of these promises that are on paper, but we're not seeing a lot of movement. I'd like first to get Victoria or Angela, if you wish to comment on anything, on any aspect of that. It would really help us to get your sense of the transitional justice policy framework in Uganda. Do you see it? How do you see it?
Maybe just clarification for the audience. The policy was passed. So our legislative process is such that you have a policy, then you have a law. So the policy was passed in 2019. And now what remains is having a Transitional Justice Act or law, so that we have a bill that is yet to be presented to cabinet. And because of some of the challenges I have already highlighted, would be the reasons why this bill hasn't yet been presented to cabinet.
Thank you, Margaret. Victoria?
Thank you so much. I'm actually grateful to be seated next to Margaret. I must acknowledge that we played a big role during the drafting of the transitional justice policy. And because in Northern Uganda, we are in groups, survivors are in groups. It's not only me, Angela, but quite a good number participated in it. And when Margaret and her team came back on ground like twice, we were so excited because we saw if they really, if the government passed the law and then it's implemented, then we would feel an acknowledgement has been done, something is being done. The only challenge that we have now is it not moving anywhere. The passing was just one thing, but if you look at 2019, this is 2023, it's like there is no clear discussion around that. So our question or appeal to all who can support, if at all the challenge is just funding or helping in crafting out something, please help us out. Let that be passed and let that be implemented. We are going to talk about reparations, but Margaret has given an in-depth thing. If it was real and to be implemented, then we would all be good to go. So one thing, that expectation, the drafting of the bill actually raised our expectation because we knew something would be done. How do we now communicate back, or how do we manage that expectation is something that remains hanging. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. Pamela, did you want to make any comment on the process?
Okay, not so much, but what I wanted to say is really to also appreciate Margaret here for bringing it to the level of having a bill in place and doing the national consultations with all the war victims. What I would only say, Lorraine, is that we are going to petition Parliament. We cannot sit and wait. And I think for me, that's the next move, that we shall petition Parliament this month to make sure that they wake up and begin to look at this bill. So again, we call for support because we have to move the war victims to carry the petition. We're already trying to work with a lawyer who is a petitioner, and we would do a private member petition. So that means we can collect more signatures. Sometimes government need to be reawakened and you cannot just sit and wait. So this is another strategy. A positive move is a petition just to allow them begin. So the Speaker of Parliament will have to receive the petition. And then from there, we see whether they will begin to look into how this bill can become an act. And we will work closely with the Ministry of Constitutional Affairs, where Margaret Ajok is. I really pray she gets back to Uganda soon from her school, but we are in touch because her house will be burning when she's seated here. And I like the fact that we have the sisterhood and solidarity because we all come from the same region where there is a problem. So she does back and forth, and we think that with consultation with her, that's the best way to move the women to Parliament and ask this same question, Lorraine. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. There is something I'd like to pick up on, and Margaret, please don't feel like you have to respond to this, but I want to flag it because Sarah isn't here, unfortunately. But the issue of acknowledgement by the government, I mean, I know the work of ICTJ, and this is an issue that they have raised in different contexts, even in relation to the ICC and the charges that have been brought against, you know, what is perceived as one side of the conflict. And I think the question of, and I'm happy Victoria mentioned this, that at least in some ways, passage of the transitional justice bill would be seen, I believe, as a form of acknowledgement. But I'm playing devil's advocate here. I just wondered whether that's enough and whether there needs to be a more formal acknowledgement, even beyond the policy itself, of some of the issues. And I tell you why. I remember going to Barloño, which was one of the areas where horrible atrocities took place. And you talked about memorialization. And when we spoke with victims groups in that area, this was a major concern. The priority there was not, I mean, compensation is always a priority, but the acknowledgement was so strong from the community. And what had happened was, and I know this is controversial, so don't feel like you need to respond. There was a memorial, there was a monument. The issue was that the number of victims that was placed on the monument was considerably less than what the community said were the number of victims. And it really was at the heart of grief for the community. In fact, this comes back to what you said about monuments. It felt like, in fact, one member said to us, every time we saw the monument, it was as if it was a statement of unacknowledgement by the government of the number of persons who had in fact been killed. So as I said, if you feel like you need to respond to that, but I do want to say it, maybe in the absence of Sarah, because this is an issue that they have constantly put on the table, about the need for there to be acknowledgement on all sides. I don't know if anyone wants to. Is Sarah there? Are you hiding? I don't want to put you on the spot, but Sarah, feel free to come in at any time. I haven't seen it.
Maybe,
as I said,
as Sarah prepares herself, maybe one thing that I should say is that acknowledgement shouldn't be a problem, in the sense that we derive, in the sense that the state has certain obligations. So acknowledging that the state has an obligation to provide redress for its citizens, I think that should be a form of acknowledgement. In terms of who does that, I think most times it's with the political leaders. And I think maybe, I don't know whether the victims have had, or the survivors have had, a perception of who they expect to acknowledge this harm. Is it the head of state, or is it enough that a minister does it? Because I know that there are occasions where certain political leaders have gone to certain regions and they have actually asked, they've, I don't know what word I can use, but they have in a way mentioned to the communities that they recognize that harms took place in those areas. So maybe the big question is, who should offer that acknowledgement? In what form? Is it legislation? Is it enough that government comes up with a law and that's enough acknowledgement, or must it be spoken, and who should speak? Who should say that? So I think for me, that's what is more important in terms of who should offer that acknowledgement and how meaningful is it for the victims.
Oh, absolutely. Was Sarah going to comment? Sorry for putting you on the spot.
Good morning, and apologies for coming in late. One of the dilemmas of attending such conferences is, of course, you don't leave your office behind. So I'm sorry, I had a conference call that I needed to attend to. But that said, I think, again, thanks to the panelists. Yes, you're right, Lorraine. Acknowledgement is one of the issues we've been pushing for as ICTJ. And our sense of acknowledgement is more of moving beyond the one-sided approach of saying there was conflict, LRA were the bad guys, they committed atrocities, UPDF were the good guys, they saved the people. In our work, we've seen what has been demanded for was recognition that there were multiple actors in this conflict, there were multiple violations that were committed, and also the state's responsibility in terms of what steps it took to respond to those violations and to protect the population. So to date, I think the dilemma that most victims have, and actually the problem is the skewed narrative, the narrative that projects the LRA as the only culpable parties in this. Now, there was an effort, and of course, that's why I think the conversation yesterday was important, is we need to place this within the broader context of Uganda's political, social dynamics at the moment. There was an effort to begin a process of official acknowledgement, and Maggie knows this. ICTJ, Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, together with JLOS, began a process of official documentation. You know, there were reports that had been published by civil society highlighting the patterns of abuse, but government consistently denied, saying, they're skewed, they're biased. So they said, let the Uganda Human Rights Commission embark on a process of documenting all the incidents of atrocities that had occurred, as possible could be, establish the number of victims that were affected, the parties that were involved, and all that. It was a comprehensive process. A database was set up, extensive technical assistance from the UN office, from ourselves, the multiple actors. We worked with JLOS to design the entire documentation process. It evolved, of course. Maggie knows the pushback. Uganda Human Rights Commission went ahead and did that. And they unearthed separate, when I talk about incidents, I'm referring to, of course, you had Lorraine referring to Balonyo massacre, Atiak massacre, Mukura massacre. That's the nature of conflict in northern Uganda, that there were incidents of horrific massacres happening in one incident, in one locality, and particular patterns. They documented, including documenting incidents where a specific battalion of the UPDF used sexual violence against men as a weapon of torture. They did that. I remember we were part of the validation exercise, and this was the first time for me where you have stakeholders, civil society, and victims who recognize a report from government and say, this time you've highlighted what happened, because it did not only focus on the LRA, it focused on all actors that were involved. Now, after the validation, we expected that this report would be launched. Government owns it and says, now, this is at least as close as a narrative that we have about what happened. And then we can move on and begin to see how the transitional justice process can respond to this, including these aspects of figures of how many people died in a massacre, some figures that you've highlighted that are disputed. Again, the political context. This report was buried. I personally was very disappointed because I invested a lot of time, we invested resources, and it goes back to the do no harm principle, where we had encouraged victim civil society, embarked on a process on building trust so that they're able to speak and share these experiences. But unfortunately, not much has yielded. So there's still no acknowledgement about what happened. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and also for raising the issue about the report of the Uganda Human Rights Commission, because the question again of mapping is something that for us is really important. The registry of the ICC is now doing mapping to see the eligible victims. There was this mapping which took place before. You know, yesterday we heard from, I think it was you, Victoria, or Angela, who said, how many times will people come back to us and ask the same question? So I think in discussing how we're going to approach this, this is definitely one of the issues that we'll need to look at. Is there data available that somehow can be used? But I wanted to ask Pamela, if you could pick up on this, because now we are moving to, given our time constraints, we want to go in a little bit deeper and to look at some of the more gendered challenges that we're seeing with not just the transitional justice process, but with the question of reparations more broadly. You've spoken a little bit about it. We've already had some discussions about the children born of war. But tell us, Pamela, what needs to be done to ensure that any reparations process that is designed is meaningful and effective for particularly vulnerable groups and populations, including women, girls, persons with disabilities, and so on?
Thank you, Lorraine. I wanted to highlight the fact that the LRA war had a strategy that look at, one of it was to use sexual abuse as one of the strategy for their, work, but also the fact that the war created a lot of vulnerabilities. There's so much extremely vulnerable individuals, EVIs, and that creates very strong perspective on gender, especially if we pick up, we would want to see the fact that reparation should really promote an engendered, victim-centered and transformative reparation processes. It's important. These include taking into consideration the intersectional conditions of women war victims and their children born of war. I would also say that there is need to establish a deliberate, dedicated, gender-sensitive reparation programs. If we want to achieve that, it should address the specific needs, which should include a priority for the women who suffered, and also include other aspects of psychosocial and medical redress system, economic empowerment, educational support, and access to legal services, especially for those who are still facing a repetitive kind of abuse and violation mentioned by Her Excellency, the Ambassador. So there is also a need that this same reparation should take up an aspect of women representation, participation, and decision-making, especially the women war victims and survivors. And we think that these processes of participation and representation still linked to allowing their decision-making processes at every stages of reparation processes, which is quite essential. But I am also looking at survivor-centeredness and how we can ensure that women and children are consulted and included in all processes of reparation, including the design, implementation, and evaluation. Again, such resources also need to be meaningful, to allocate it into the core needs and aspect of women and those who suffered multiple vulnerability, and taking into consideration intersectional needs of women war victims, especially the conversation of yesterday on the feminist approach, which is important. For example, we recognize that our women victim and survivor participated at very many layers in terms of effects. They were fighters, they were wives, they were mothers, they were caregivers, they had children, and some other people had multiple children. And we also want to talk about these issues of children born of war. Lorraine, I want you to note that the eldest child born in captivity now is between 27 to 30 years of age. This is now an adult. You can't say they are children, and they have their own needs. They, moreover, are supposed to be taken up also through a separate approach in terms of reparation, that their reparation should be completely separate, not together with their mother. And also recognizing that women has double multiple issues to deal with, because all these children are linked to their maternal side and not paternity, because like Margaret said, a lot of the LRA men were giving codes to their names. If somebody is Okelo and Okelo comes from Pabo, and then that when you go to Pabo, there are very many Okelos. So which one is the father of your child? Now, that makes the responsibility of the reintegration processes to be meaningful discussion with traditional leaders. So I get into the traditional mechanism here, which is part of the TJ processes also highlighted in the TJ policy currently. And I think that this redress can help the aspect of reintegration traditionally so that women from their side can go back to their relatives and put together the cultural leaders to support the processes of reintegration in terms of allocation of land, accepting responsibility for children as they belong to their community. And also, Sarah mentioned the issues of do no harm, but we need to look at how that cannot also lead to discrimination. How can they be accepted? And you should remember also that why the gender sensitivity is that every woman is more concerned about their children. Unless we discuss the issues of their children, they remain restless. And unless they see that their children, and these children are asking questions, why are we not in school? Why are we different from other kids? Why are we not accessing services? Because we are stateless, how can we not get employable opportunity? At the age of 27 and 30, you can fend for yourself if you can be accepted. So all this conversation is compounded and needed to be addressed for the aspect of reparation. It's also essential for me that we need to promote and support grassroots initiative, because I think that there are so many processes of reparations that might not require essentially resources like money, but it requires a complete processes of acceptance, complete processes of healing. How do we promote a peaceful coexisting environment for these kids so that they don't live on street, but they still align themselves to the community, especially where their mothers are coming from. They need to push government to, especially parliament. I'm looking at parliament from the fact that the legislators are elected from these constituencies where war victims are coming from. And it beats my mind that they do not prioritize this issue and they need to be pushed, you know? So there is necessary push that we need to do, especially for a legislation like Margaret has already said, because in the transitional justice system and the policy mechanism, there is an opportunity for reparation for people who are not victim of Dominic Ongwen case. Because we need to ask ourselves, how is that even going to happen? That reparation by the ICC is going to be supported, leaving the bigger picture of the LRA atrocities in northern Uganda. And the biggest population are not the Dominic Ongwen case. You know, they are not the core yellow case with the ICD. So, and how is it even the ICD case with core yellow reparation going to be similar with the ICC? And how is that not going to re-traumatize the whole region and break up another group of war because people are incomplete in terms of satisfaction with reparation? So I think there should be a bigger discussion. Can the transitional justice policy for Uganda take up the responsibility of reparation of other victims, which is not the Dominic Ongwen case? More coordination, more documentation, more donor flexibility in ensuring multiple programs that can take up the gaps that comes in all these processes of reparation. A feminist approach, a gender-sensitive approach, and ensuring that gender transformative approaches is included in the reparation. It could be transformative, it could be restorative approaches, but I think all these are sensitive and essential component for, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Again, flagging very important issues, but I do want to bring in very quickly the voices of Angela and Victoria. And definitely very deliberately so, because we've heard all of these things. We've heard about, gender transformative. We've heard about all of that. In fact, the ambassador used an expression. She said, there must be co-creation. And I just am very curious to hear from you, Victoria. What would that mean for you? What are victims really expecting when we're talking about the design of reparations, whether it is reparations from the perspective of the Ongwen case, which, as we've said, is quite limited, but more broadly, reparations as Margaret outlined under the Transitional Justice Policy Framework. But what does co-creation mean for you as a survivor in terms of being part of that process of seeing this thing work?
Thank you so much. From the remarks of the ambassador, the presentation by Margaret, and then submission by Pamela, I think a lot has been discussed. I'll just speak in the voice of a survivor. Yes, everyone is expecting reparations, and we have all acknowledged that indeed harm that happens to an individual or a group can never be repaired. But the healing can happen, even if it may never also fully happen. I have moved on. A lot is fairly good in my life, but there are things that still affect me and I still fall back down. What about the others who have not even seen the light? So expectations of the victim on ground is that something can be done that would enable them to at least move from the current state to a fairly better one. We have all acknowledged children born of war. Just the fact that you're a victim of sexual violence is a pain. Over 80% of women that returned have never been married. They are with their children. If somebody gets another man and they give birth to another child, they are left over time. Angela might say this as well. We have had women who tried. You reach somewhere and they say, of all women, is that the person you could go for? At the end, they are dropped again with more children. Other women now have 4, 5. We can't blame them. We are all human. And there's that aspect of life that you can't miss out. So in the discussions we have been having, many think or even request that if it was possible, the priority would be individual reparation for specific category. Why am I saying this? From land, no education, no home, to nothing. There is no identity of your child. The maternal people are not also easy. All these people seated here are from the Acholi region, northern Uganda. The issue of land is real. People will reject you because they know if they take you up, then automatically you or your child should benefit from the land that they have. The best is not to have you closer. So when we think about this, even if transitional justice policy is to address, we still have to mind of that silent issues that affect individuals and that would never impact their lives completely. The collective reparation is good, but we can't just look at that. For example, these kids have even grown. If we put schools in place, will our children really benefit, especially for students, women who have not sent their kids to school? They can't now benefit from that. The women who have the bullets in their body, those who have gynecological issues, the general health centers put in place does not address the specific medical condition that they have. So I understand the complexity of everything, but also trying to be extra to identify specific survivors who really have those silent needs that need to be helped, may it be a good thing. Be it in the case of Ongwen victims, be it in the national approach that the government is going to take. On concerning Ongwen case, we discussed and women were like, now they talk of Ongwen being charged for sexual violence. Then they are telling us only victims that were in senior brigade from 2000 can qualify to gain. What about some of us who suffered sexual violence? Does the international court, criminal court, not know that there were many people in LRA captivity just beyond the senior brigade? What about a woman who could have been raped just 2 days to a specific event happening, but was never part of the senior brigade? How will we know? There are people who were abducted within that point, but even if we go into identifying them, they may never give any concrete evidence that show that they really suffered. So I'll come back to co-creation. Working with the victims, working with the survivors will help to understand specific silent issues that would make it harder to really know what happened. How can you identify who could have even just been part of this system, even if it was just like within hours? Angela will tell you, if you sat or have ever been in the LRA setting for even 3 hours, there are things that happens, there are statements that are made that when this one says, you can never say no. You know, this person was part of it. So it is our humble request that as we sit, we keep thinking. These are discussions that are happening. We may not do it now, but something can still be turned around the clock to make sure that nobody is left behind, just like Pamela said. But in my voice and the voice of the others, in the video, reparation is really important for specific category of people. And of course, everyone will say, oh, survivors need compensation. In the video already factor in those different aspects. Is it, do I have like a gynecological issue? Do I have a medical? Do I need a job? Something to do. But I will also acknowledge that we can't get everything that we need, but just a step towards 2 things can lead you somewhere. Every process begins with a step. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Angela wasn't originally meant to be on the panel, but I wanted to give her the opportunity as well if she wanted to speak on this issue. Angela, perhaps you could share if you wanted, what would reparations mean for the women who have been waiting? And anything at all that you might want to say, is there anything that should be prioritized? What difference would it all make? So you can speak, you can decide if you want to or not. I'll leave it to you.
Okay, thank you so much for all the panelists that have mentioned the issues and the concern of the survivors and victims. Yeah, I'm not going to repeat what they have said because they have said it all, most of it. But I've been working with the children born of sexual violence in captivity, and I was also questioning my mind that now that we are in the process of reparation, just as Victoria mentioned, the children who are already men, who are already fathers, some of them who are already mothers, need to be reparated differently. They have their own issues. Right now, we are struggling with the issues of during the pandemic, many of the girls who are born in captivity were pregnant, and they got pregnant. And right now we are having research with Miguel University, who is helping us to really understand their experience. And as we do reparation, as we plan for this, we have to think of this as we have children who are born in captivity, who have children who are suffering the same cause. Their relationship, there are some who their relationship with their parents is now even becoming a conflict tension because a child is big, a child has not gone to school, and there's nothing that the mother can do, and people are taking advantage of. And the same situation that we passed through, these children are passing through, these adult CBC are passing through, and their children are passing through. Just like one of the girls mentioned to me when she came to seek for support. She said, I dropped out of school because my mother could not pay school fees. When I came to you people to help me, you supported me, but the period was so small that I decided to go for shoe crafting, but because you said because of funding, you could not take me long, all the material and everything got just faded. And this boy, this man comes to me and tell me, I can support you. I can give you the money for the material to buy so that you continue with your business. After that, he used me. I thought that was my future because I had nowhere to turn to. I have been rejected from my paternal home. And to worst of it, I was taken to another home. That was not my real paternal home. So here we are. Ever since, I have never seen my mother's place. I got this child. The man rejected me. I was stigmatized. I came back to my mother. My mother said, you are now an adult. I am also struggling because of you. I am here. I've never gone back to our home. I have also been rejected. That is how I went back to the street. And what she said, I hear you're helping people, but I am coming to sleep in your office because now I have 2 children. Again, I was deceived. And people blame me that I am a prostitute. I don't have a father, I don't have identity, but I am looking to survive. How can we help such a person? So meaning reparation, as the period goes, as we seek for justice, as we are seeking for petition in the parliament, as we are working so hard to do this, these children are growing up. These children are going through a lot. And it is going to be reoccurrence, sexual abuse, and I would say a lot of trauma and stress that is struggling these children. So I would say this time, let's be flexible enough to think about the children who are born of sexual violence in the community and reparate them. And I agree with my with Vicky that individual reparation is better for the survivors and the victims. Thank you.
Sorry again to come back, but something that Pat asked yesterday and I responded on, I thought it would be important today, is the aspect of how priorities of victims, survivors change over time. So even as we continue to design, the time those of Margaret started drafting the TJ policy, the ranking of priority was different. Now it is 10 years down the road. Priorities keep what? Keep changing, meaning as we think of drafting some of this policy, designing programs and so forth, it's important we don't restrict the time to maybe 1-2 years. It could even go to 20 years, but maybe in a situation where it's drafted and implemented, then individuals have to sustain that program. And then still it gets back to what Ambassador said earlier on, co-creation. When you do it together with the victims, the survivors themselves, then you get to understand how the needs are changing and design things that wouldn't harm them anymore, but work towards addressing the issue. Thank you.
Excellent point, Victoria. And it leaves me only now to open the floor for some final questions, remarks, and any final thoughts from all of us who have listened to these ladies. I'll just mention some of the things that they've said that might spark some additional discussion: the intergenerational nature of the harms that the women have suffered, the particular vulnerabilities of the children born of sexual violence, prioritization, the fact of what Victoria just said about the changing needs of the survivors. I don't know whether there are any questions online as well, or we have any further questions or comments before we bring things to a close. Emily?
Thanks, Lauren. Hi, for those I haven't met yet who are here for the first time today, I'm Emily Kenny from UN Women headquarters here in New York. So I have a couple of kind of specific reflections and things to share, but after this panel, I feel like they're a little bit, like they're not nearly as deep as your reflection. So I just want to acknowledge how amazing that panel was. And really, Angela, the story that you just shared is really very, very moving. And also, thank you for thanking UN Women at the beginning of this. I'm just so proud that our funding could be used to bring Pamela, Victoria, Angela, and Betty here to New York. And to thank the UK, who is also the donor to UN Women for this project, UK Prevention of Sexual Violence Initiative. Okay, so now my kind of much less deep thoughts and responses. So yesterday we were talking about the amicus submissions in the Ongwen appeals. There was also a call for amicus in the reparations part of the case. And the United Nations actually came together to submit an amicus on that part. And the reparations decision is still not out yet, so we don't know how the court might respond to the UN submission. But if you Google United Nations, amicus, Ongwen, reparations, you will see it come up. And actually, that's how I went back to look at it earlier this morning, and that's how I found it. So I know you can find it that way. It's online. In the amicus, we referenced a mapping that UN Women did with a partner. UN Women Uganda did a mapping of more than 2,800 women and girls who were formerly abducted. And Margaret, I'll try to get that to you or to anyone that you suggest, just to make sure that I think it's so important not to replicate efforts that have already been done. So if that study can be of use. In the mapping of 2,800 women and girls, 61.8% had no access to land, and only 11.4% had post-primary education. So just to, I think it's amazing that we have Victoria and Angela here with us, but as they keep reminding us, they're just the tip of the iceberg of representing survivors of these crimes. And what the stories that they have shared, though, are also reflective of the broader data that we have. And then the last thing that I want to say is, Pamela, you're kind of, saying like, we as women have to push for this. And I wrote down like, that's it. And that's it. That's how it happens. That's how it happens, not just in Uganda, that's how it happened in Kosovo, where we have a national reparations program specifically for conflict-related sexual violence. There were 4 victims associations who said, we have to have this. And they were the ones who pushed for it. In Guatemala, case that Susanna knows very, very well, and I'll be on a panel this afternoon. I think I'll probably mention it in my remarks too. A national case that moved forward only because of a fantastic, very small group of women, but that grew over time. So your push, that is how it will happen. It will not happen any other way. And then last thing I will say is I'm very excited to bring this conversation to Uganda. And I keep making notes of what I hope UN Women, we have a country office in Uganda that we will do to take this conversation back to Kampala, to Gulu, to the Acholi region, to make sure that we're not just having this discussion in New York, but that we're also having it with a larger group of survivors and women's organizations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again for an amazing discussion. Just two thoughts to add. One is I hear you on the need to have a longitudinal approach in understanding and following survivors' priorities over time, because they absolutely do change. And just to flag, and maybe some of you already know of this, back when I was at Berkeley, our team there had done, I think, 3 studies going into the North, getting justice priorities over time over the course of a decade, with this understanding that priorities will change as time goes on. And so that may be, as Emily said, we have some baseline information, but more follow-up, including as children have grown up now, as you mentioned, I think will be very important. And it certainly doesn't have to be the Berkeley team that does it, but it sounds like you're working with McGill, other teams. We can help with that type of research. The other thing I was thinking, listening to, and I think many of us have known this in the back of our heads, but you brought into such clear and stark relief the disparity in potential reparations, depending which judicial process we're talking about. There are already inequalities built into how the ICC reparations will work, probably. Compare that to the Coelho ultimate proceedings. And then, as you mentioned, the folks who are not yet represented in a judicial process, which highlights 2 things for me. One is the clear importance of non-judicial reparations. You know, either administrative processes like Emily has alluded to in Kosovo, for example. Like, what is the possibility of that at the national level? But then also thinking creatively, I think sometimes our international criminal law box is just it's not sufficient, right? Look right across next door into Kenya, the post-election violence, the huge degree of sexual violence that was committed in late 2007, early 2008. Of course, that ICC case didn't go anywhere, but we had incredible feminist lawyers in a national and international coalition bring a constitutional claim using human rights law and Kenya's new constitution to charge the state with failure to protect, right? And they have a good outcome in that case. Now they're talking about reparations, but maybe we need to look at complementary legal frameworks also to really fill out the need for reparations that maybe this purely ICL process is just not going to deliver.
Thank you very much, Kim. And I think there's another gentleman here, but I'd like to comment on that about complementary mechanisms, because while I was at Redress, this was something that we were actually doing as well with FIDA, Uganda, to bring a civil claim against the government of Uganda. Unfortunately, this was one of them was in relation to the victims in Barlonio. And unfortunately, we ran into challenges with a very dishonest attorney. I think you may be aware of the case, but what I'm saying is this was one of other cases that have been started in Uganda through the civil courts. So I think this is also something that really needs to be mentioned as well in terms of some steps that are being taken. Fully agree. Was there? Oh, yes.
Yes, Michael Myers, New York Civil Rights Coalition again. I must say to all of you, all the panelists, that what strikes me about all your presentations is a particular word, and that's hope. You all have hope. So my question is the exact opposite of hope, and that's this: is there any sense of defeat, of desolation, of decline in terms of moral righteousness on the part of the population, such as what's the rate of suicide? What's the rate of homicide? What's the rate of self-defeat on the part of the people who do not have hope? And what's the measurements for changing that?
Thank you very much. I don't know whether, before I hand over to the panelists to, if they wish to address that, do we have any final questions? Because after that, we'll wrap up. Okay, did anyone want to take that question on? Pamela?
Yeah, thank you. It's true, it cannot just be hope without the opposite. And I would say that a lot of that was caused by delayed justice, delayed transitional justice policy. It's true that some of the war victims are dying, you know. We recorded cases of some people that were part of the war victim associations and group. I work with the Trust Fund and the ICC for 9 years in providing physical rehabilitation program for war victims. We also work with UN Women, especially we just concluded the Women Peace Humanitarian Fund. And you could find that in our record, we physically rehabilitated 1,722 victims. And the most expensive part of them is that we have also complicated cases like hip relocation, and sometimes you have to bring in place prosthesis material from Germany. You have to deal with issues of discrimination in terms of color. But the other psychosocial aspect, people need to speak, people need to be heard. Some of the healing processes come with sharing this information. And I would tell you that Victoria and Angela will tell you once they speak, there's a way they feel different, you know. So how are we encouraging these spaces for redress, for allowing psychosocial redress and emotional redress? That is what creates a peaceful coexisting environment. When people know that, yes, I have a problem, but I'm accepted, different from the other aspect of public apology in terms of who can do that. So if you go to northern Uganda, the street looks good, you know, in terms of reconstruction and rehabilitation. The Chinese are giving us new road, but mentally, you know, you can even be knocked on with the car while you cross the road, because there is unfinished business. We need total healing processes. And that is what is killing us, the war victim as well. Some of them are not rising up again because they think they have reached the end of the road. So we need to acknowledge that, including yesterday, I spoke about, I'm happy that Her Excellency also mentioned about reoccurrence of cases. We have women who are from the war victims groups of survivors, surviving all the time, sexual and gender-based. Some of them are suffered raped, but they again suffered abused. So these are incidences that are happening. Thank you. For lack of time, I think I will stop there.
Yeah, maybe just to confirm, there are confirmed statistics that show that the North has higher mental health indices than the rest of the country. So there are confirmed studies that show that there are high rates of suicide, particularly in the North, and there is a particular district, I don't know what the history is, but that particular district recurrently has rates of suicide. Yeah, so those are like established statistics. Yeah.
Victoria, you have the last word.
Thank you. So I just thought I should share this. One thing that has helped victims in northern Uganda is that we have quite a number of groups, survivor groups. In these groups, there are stories that are told every time people meet to do the Village Savings and Loans Association that Margaret talked about later. That is one form of providing peer support to one another. But as you tell the story, you get to hear that even the other person seems to be struggling more than you are. That feeling of having a shared challenge and so forth puts people together. There's a sense of belonging, and we are moving on. Thank you.
So on behalf of all of the organizers, I want to personally thank all of the panelists for their very, very rich intervention. I do want to flag that as has been said, the process, the reparations process in Ongwen and indeed in Uganda is an ongoing one. And it is important for us not to forget some of the critical issues and how, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated some of the issues that we've seen. So as they've shared their stories, let this not be the end of the conversation. In the interest of time, I won't summarize, but I will put in a plug. And that is, do you see these quilts behind us? These are the stories, and Victoria knows better than I do. These were brought by Victoria, and these really tell the stories of some of the survivors. They were made by the survivors. Pamela and her team also brought bags that were made by survivors. What I'm saying is that alongside all of the institutional and other efforts, the women are making efforts themselves to tell their stories, to find their own ways of healing. So please also support that. Thank you.
Okay, so that wraps up the morning session. We will have participants hang out for a few minutes in the moot courtroom. And so anyone who is a panelist or speaker, please come to the front and we'll take a photo. Everyone else will, lunch is ready, so please join us for lunch. For those of you online, we'll be reconvening the hybrid part of the event at 3 p.m. So we'll see you at that moment in time. We'll start with our final panel of the afternoon, and enjoy lunch. And we'll be back. We have concurrent sessions from the 1:45 to 1:15, sorry, to 2:45 p.m. slot for those of you who are here in the room. And we can talk more specifically about that over the lunch time. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.